Well, Paul, hello, how are you?
I'm good. How are you, Martin?
I'm feeling pretty good. Let's talk about where we are with our favorite villain, Donald Trump, or President Trump, as he should be called. Now we're getting towards the end of a year, and I get the impression from reading your Substack that you're feeling that things are going so badly, as it were, and the American people have really begun to notice this, and maybe things aren't quite as grim. At least they're grim, but the grimness implies maybe things will get better in the not incredibly distant future. So overall, how are you feeling?
Well, I'm less terrified than I was. I mean, if you're, let's be serious here. What is clearly the the agenda? I mean, this is not a normal presidency. This is not normal politics in the United States. What we have is a group of would-be authoritarians trying to speed run a transition into one-party, non-democratic rule. It's clear that the goal was to, before anybody had a chance really to stand up to them, to end U.S. democracy more or less permanently. I mean, that's not hyperbole. That's just kind of where we are. And the good news is it does not seem to be going well, or at least it's not going according to schedule. It's people like Orban in Hungary or Putin in his early years had broad public support during their extended takeovers. Trump's support has cratered. If you had doubts about the polling, these elections in New Jersey and Virginia that we had early in November said, oh no, the polling is right. If anything, it's understating how much the public now loathes Donald Trump. Now, that's not necessarily enough. There's still a lot of craven politicians and craven institutions. At least the momentum has slowed. Now, whether we can actually turn this around, that's, ask me in a couple of years.
The big point you make there is one I've been completely convinced of for a very long time. In fact, even in 2016, I think I've noted before that I fear that if he were allowed to, that was exactly where Donald Trump was going to try and take the US. And of course, with him, most of the hope for liberal democracy in the world. And so I've been also very, very anxious. And I've been surprised, actually, how many of my friends who are also very concerned about the issue have been really remarkably complacent about it all. But on this, you and I agree completely. Now, let's before just step back and talk a little bit about what we're going to be trying to do. This is going to be the second series with you, the Wolf-Krugman exchange, as we called it, on our economics show. And we're going to have 4 episodes running over the next 4 weeks. And we'll be talking about what's going on in the US, what's going on in the world, and where all this might lead us after having experienced this first year, which we just touched upon. And we'll also, of course, particularly be focusing on the US economy. We'll look at MAGA man. How much of the economics of male employment and male income driving support for Trump? And we'll discuss, I think, how other countries are reacting to the United States' rather unpredictable approach to economic policy. And we might say foreign policy, given the démarche that the US just gave to Ukraine on a deal which they seem to have negotiated entirely with Mr. Putin's people. It's a pretty weird story even now, isn't it?
Oh, everything is weird. And, we're in a situation where on diplomacy, we're actually getting conflicting stories from different members of the administration about what the policy is, who wrote it. The initial leaked peace plan showed clear signs of having been translated directly from the Russian. The syntax was basically not that of a native English speaker. Wild stuff. You think about policy in terms of there's a process and who are the players and how does it work. But this appears to be no process. And there's reason to believe that different actors, the vice president, the secretary of state, are kind of independently trying to make foreign policy. And it's not at all clear that Trump has any idea what's going on. I mean, this is wild. The world's greatest nation, and here we are, and we're putting tin pot dictatorships to shame in terms of our disorganization.
I was just told by one of my colleagues, distinguished colleague who was in America last week, that every single Russian expert in the State Department has been sacked. So it's not surprising. I'm assuming that's correct. It's not surprising that they look completely clueless and they have to take the text given to them by the Russians.
Yeah, we could go on about that. I mean, this is, of course, the diplomacy, but as far as we can make out things like healthcare, basically large parts of the Centers for Disease Control, National Institutes of Health, they've laid off anybody who knew anything. And so we have critical policy being made by people who really haven't the faintest idea how any of this works. So I've been saying that we're kind of ruled by sinister incompetence right now, and quite something.
One sort of has this terrifying nightmare that they're actually going to just start World War III by accident.
Well, yeah,
pressing the wrong button.
Well, there was this incident a while back where they accidentally laid off all the people who secure our nuclear weapons. And
yes, I remember that.
They realized, and then had a hard time getting them back because they had taken away their government emails. I mean,
anyway, in our series, we'll talk about China too, which beyond the US, the rest of the world, Europe, and so forth. But let's kick off with something we often do on the Economic Show, where we put something on a scale from 1 to 10. So after a year of Trump, how healthy in one number, scale 1 to 10, with 1 terrible and 10 everything is great, do you feel the US economy is now, and perhaps also in comparison with where it was in January?
It's clearly in worse shape than it was in January. And maybe it's a 5, the normal indicators, unemployment rate, inflation rate, are worse than they were in 2024. Unemployment is a few tenths of a percentage point higher. Inflation, which had been on a downward trajectory, is now up. It's not catastrophe. We're not in a recession, but then there are weird shadows in the economy that make it, in some ways, considerably worse, probably, in terms of how it's experienced than these conventional numbers would say, and also huge risks because so much is being driven by highly speculative investments in AI.
When I thought about this question, I would have given them about a 5 too. So at a distance, I would agreed. It isn't a catastrophe, but it's clearly sort of sliding downhill. And before we go on to that a little bit more, what would your number between 1 and 10 be for the state of American democracy at the moment?
We're below that. We're at a 4 or a 3. But not a 0. It's and maybe trending up. That's there just has been a lot more pushback. We certainly things are happening on a routine basis now that were completely unthinkable. If your worst fantasy, did you imagine that masked government agents would be kidnapping people off the street? And that's now a routine occurrence in our major cities. So, gosh, this is not a fully functioning democracy. And we look, enviously at places that know how to do democracy seriously, like Brazil, and pretty humiliating for an American. Public pushback. A lot of institutions just folded, but the public has not. And so I think they're not. I'm just vastly encouraged by the fact that we did have just gubernatorial elections, but they were blowouts for what is clearly a referendum on Trump. And if you look underneath, it's in some ways even better. It really does look as if the idea that there was a MAGA coalition that was going to rule is not going to happen unless they basically use force and intimidation, which is not out of the question.
I was just thinking about your comment about a country with a functioning democracy. I would also say a country with a functioning legal system, because they put Bolsonaro in prison, and the American president's reaction to that was to whack a 50% tariff on them for the cheek of putting somebody who was tried to overthrow an election into prison, which is obviously, from his point of view, a pretty horrible precedent. But it certainly gets the contrast, and it is, for somebody like me, always an Americanophile, absolutely horrifying.
Yeah, it's absolutely horrifying. But then if you like some of those tariffs, many of those tariffs on Brazil have just come off because American consumers are outraged about the price of coffee. And so that's in a way telling you, we would love to see that there was a mass public uprising against the threat to democracy. And, we did have something like 7 million people march against Trump not very long ago. But what really is killing the Trump, the MAGA drive to take over America is the price of groceries.
My view had been that what has happened has very dire long-term consequences, but I wasn't clear that there was going to be some crash, at least on the actions he's taken so far. So what's been happening to the economy hasn't really surprised me. I see about a protection of this kind as more likely to have longer-term, medium to long-term effects than short-term effects. Have you been surprised in any way by what you describe as the number 5 economy? Is that more or less what you would have guessed?
I think I'm pretty much on record as saying that this idea that protectionism causes a recession is not really right. It's not borne out by history. It's not borne out actually by basic economic models. Tariffs degrade long-run efficiency. They hurt long-run performance. Now, what was special and is visible in some of the numbers is the uncertainty. It's one thing if Trump had, just sort of permanently imposed tariffs that were 1934 level, I wouldn't have said that would be recessionary at all. It'd be a terrible thing for the long run, but not recessionary. But it was the uncertainty, the constantly changing tariffs that we, seemed likely to have a chilling effect on business. How's a business going to invest when it has no idea what the trade regime will be next month? You can see it a little bit more subtly in some of the numbers, but at the same time, unfortunately, history doesn't serve us controlled experiments where just one thing happens at a time. So we have simultaneously this radical break with 90 years of U.S. trade policy, and at the same time, this vast boom in artificial intelligence. And so most investment is kind of weak. Most businesses are not hiring. But on the other hand, they're spending enormous amounts of money on data centers. And that in some ways has masked whatever the effects of Trump's policies might be.
You've written quite a bit recently, I think, about vibes. Is that, to you, a significant part of why it's not doing as well as you would expect? That it's not something concrete, is that despite this huge AI investment boom, but somehow the mood, if you look at the confidence measures of various kinds, the Americans really do seem rather gloomy. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes. Now, it's not, by the way, we should say that consumer spending has not fallen as much, has not fallen a lot. It's despite the fact that people say that they're quite unhappy with the economy. So in some sense, this is, if we look at what people do rather than what they say, it's a little bit out of kilter. But yeah, I mean, many people have made the analogy with the late 90s, which was both the dot-coms, but even more important, the telecom investment boom, which ended in grief for a lot of companies. People were giddy. The ordinary person was feeling that they were part of this great adventure of prosperity. Now, it didn't last, but and there's been none of that now. There's nobody out there who is thinking, well, NVIDIA is doing well, and that means that anybody can make it. That's not how it's playing now. Consumer sentiment is at its lowest point ever. It's lower than it was in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. It's lower than it was in 1980 when we had 14% inflation. That's, people are really, really down on the economy, and it's interesting because they've remained. I had thought that Trump might be getting better ratings on the economy than Biden did. But in fact, the vibecession has, if anything, intensified.
So why do you think that is? What's going on here? I was just thinking as you were talking that I recognize this contrast with the late 90s. Well, I think the overall economy seemed to be doing better. Was part of it that with the dot-com bubble, everybody felt they could sort of get in on it? But here, what we're seeing is a booming expenditure by a really small number of gigantic companies, which is quite different from the sort of players in that. They are real businesses, there's no doubt about that. But they looked like a bunch of incredibly powerful oligopolists. And that doesn't really excite ordinary Americans because it doesn't really have anything to do with them.
Yeah, I mean, the dot-com stuff was sometimes silly, often silly, and people even kind of recognized the silliness. But it was kind of nice. I mean, a feeling of that there were opportunities. I think everybody understood that some of these things were really not going to work. But and now, yeah, it's the same. I mean, having Google and Mark Zuckerberg, leading the charge into the future does not give you a lot of confidence that the future is going to be very good for the common man.
I just wrote a column last week on Mark Zuckerberg's business, and in which I pointed out that there's a recent, very detailed and I think well-researched report by Reuters, which indicates that about 10% of their profits come from advertising for scams. Well, I think that's sort of filtering through to people, isn't it? I mean, this is a bit of a deviation, but isn't there some sort of awareness that some of these businesses aren't really quite the businesses we want to be so big and powerful? Is that is that part of the vibe before we go back to the economics?
Yes, I think it is. And I think people do have a sense, first of all, that these businesses are very heavily built on scams, on basically hacking your brain to indulging your and encouraging your worst instincts. Not a day goes by without some horror story about ChatGPT encouraging people to do something stupid or self-destructive. And if we have a government that clearly, basically, is a government of, by, and for predators, that's in ways that, including ways that we won't get into, but and that does filter through. Everybody has a kind of sick feeling about where we are right now.
Do you think that one of the factors here, which you've written a lot about and seems to me very important for the ordinary American sense of themselves, is that this government administration is so blatantly corrupt and so obviously in bed with a very small number of immensely wealthy plutocrats, and to a degree which, of course, this was the famous story back in the beginning of the last century, the great Gilded Age period. But this seems in practice to be more egregious. Is this part of the vibe Americans are having? Is that part of what they're reacting against?
Well, it's very hard to pin that down. And I suspect that fewer people than you think are really aware of that. One of the things we've learned, and I'm following the political scientists and poll analysts and so on, is that it's very difficult for people like you and me who are immersed in this stuff to appreciate how tangential much of the news is to ordinary people. And I'm not sure, even if you did a poll and you asked, are you aware of that Elon Musk gets a lot of his money from government contracts? I would guess that many people are not. But I think there is a general sense that it's unfair. Inequality doesn't actually have as much traction politically as you might expect, but unfairness does. And the sense of that we're in a regime of unfairness everywhere really does.
Now, we've been reading a lot over here about this affordability idea. And that it was obviously what Mr. Mamdani campaigned on in New York, and he certainly won a pretty spectacular victory. And an encomium from Donald Trump, which must be one of the most surprising meetings I've ever seen in my fairly lengthy life. Is he on to something here that somehow this links perhaps with their feeling about what happened with the inflation under Joe Biden, that there are really important things that have become sort of unaffordable for ordinary people? You've written about housing, rents and so forth. How live is that really as an issue? And do you think it'll last?
We had a bout of inflation, really from 2021 to 2023. It really was a one-time step jump in prices. People are upset about the jump in the level of prices, especially because we'd had 3+ decades of very low inflation before it.
They expected 2% a year, so 6% over 3 years, and they got roughly 20. And that's sort of, they say, we got cheated.
Yeah, and although wages went up a lot, And contrary to what many people believe, actually wages rose more towards the bottom of the wage distribution. So we actually had an equalization. So ordinary, struggling families on the whole were better off in terms of purchasing power. But it's a natural thing. You feel that you earned your wage increase, and then it was snatched away by the inflation. So that's a big part of it. The consumer price index is honest. It's based on a lot of hard thinking about how to measure the cost of living, but it may be missing it doesn't really take account of interest costs. It doesn't take account of, particularly the housing is one of those things where prices really have outpaced earnings. And so the sense that my father was able to buy a house and I can't, that is not wrong. Wages have risen more than grocery prices over the last 5 years or so, but wages have not risen more than housing prices. And so there's some real affordability stuff.
But doesn't this imply that Mr. Mamdani is not going to be able to do much about affordability, but then neither is Mr. Trump? Particularly, we'll come to the labour market, given that the tariffs, presumably the price effects of the tariffs, as I see it, are still coming through, because a lot of the price effect was clearly absorbed by business, but it's not going to be absorbed forever, is it?
That's right. Although one quirk is that it's turned out that the effective tariffs are not as high as the posted tariffs, and part of the reason there is it's not really, we think, a lot of illegal tariff evasion, but there were a lot of things that businesses could do to avoid paying tariffs that weren't worth doing when we had 2% tariffs and are worth doing when we have 17% tariffs. So there's been a lot of, but the pass-through, we've probably seen something like half of the eventual price impact of tariffs on consumer prices, and the rest is working its way through the pipeline. Part of the reason that the rage over affordability has persisted, I think that might have started to fade if we'd had some kind of continuity, except Trump ran a campaign all about, I am going to bring prices down. I'm going to cut the price of energy in half. I'm going to make your groceries much cheaper. And then obviously hasn't delivered on that and hasn't even made an effort to deliver on that. And people feel betrayed, which is, coming back to where we started, I'm glad that people feel betrayed. That this is important.
Well, obviously he works on the assumption that the promises I made have nothing to do with what happened 6 months later. People shouldn't hold me to account for something I said 6 months earlier. That's just unfair.
Yeah, I mean, this is Trump's whole modus operandi, is that a promise from Trump is a suggestion at best, but that kind of works when you're dealing with, university presidents, but it doesn't work when you're dealing with the American public.
Just one final thing on the tariffs. We've got this really rather important case in front of the Supreme Court on whether what he's done is legal. My own reading of American trade law, and I know a few experts, is that it isn't. My confidence that the Supreme Court will decide that it's illegal isn't very great, given some of the other things they've decided. What do you think the Supreme Court's going to do?
My guess is that this may be a step too far even for the Supreme Court. The president can do some special things to deal with economic emergencies, but when Trump imposes tariffs on Brazil because they have the temerity to try Bolsonaro, that I don't think fits the definition of an economic emergency. And 2 lower courts have already ruled that the tariffs are in fact illegal. The prediction markets say that there's only a 26% chance as of this morning that the court will uphold Trump's tariffs, which looks about right to me. So, hey, God knows. I mean, this is about 70% of the tariffs would be voided.
Can he get round that? Can he ignore it?
Well, just blatantly ignoring it, I think, does become a problem. I mean, this is an issue that applies much more to things like members of the military. But if you're a Customs and Border Patrol agent and you collect a tariff that the Supreme Court has ruled illegal, I think that you are personally liable. You have yourself broken the law.
He couldn't pretend that, quote unquote, breaking the law is an official act, which the Supreme Court in an earlier judgment decided was actually completely kosher.
Yeah, well, and there are other routes around. The president has a lot of leeway to impose tariffs to protect national security, as Section 232, and Trump has been doing that quite a lot. So not all of it is under this Emergency Powers Act, but there too, I would imagine that the potential legal challenges are huge. I mean, he's imposed national security tariffs on bathroom vanities. Because,
Yes,
God help us if we get into an international conflict and we depend on China for our bathroom vanities. On any reasonable standard, almost everything he's done on trade is illegal. But we do not live in an age of reasonable standards.
but it could be possibly a very important judgment.
Yes, it could
because if they do come out against him, that's an important judgment on what is, after all, for him and for the world, his signature policy.
Yeah. And it's humiliating if the court rules that his signature policy is illegal. And it's I don't know. I think we're less certain, but it does look hard to see how you can rule that the tariffs were illegal and avoid giving the money back. So, quite a scene.
Generative AI is here to stay, and the transformation of the global information ecosystem is happening now. ProRata's suite of innovative AI solutions is igniting that change with a revolutionary model that gives content the respect it deserves while promoting a sustainable and trustworthy information ecosystem. Because when AI uses content, its creators deserve credit. Discover the future of fair and transparent content use in AI search at prorata.ai.
So let's talk about the labor market. Is what's going on there a significant factor for this vibecession, as it were? Well, more than that, a sort of anxiety about prospects for jobs?
We have not yet had mass layoffs. We've not yet seen large job losses. But what we have seen
is a lot of hiring.
Very low hiring. It's a frozen labor market, probably, at least in part, because of tariffs and general uncertainty. But businesses are not hiring. They're not firing a lot either. If you're in your job, then you're reasonably secure. But should you lose your job, or if you're a young person entering the market for the first time, it's actually very grim. Overall unemployment isn't up very much, but long-term unemployment is, because once you've lost a job, it's very hard to find another one. And this does reflect back. Even people who have jobs have the sense, correct?
It's frightening.
Yeah. If
you lose a job, you've had it, maybe.
Yeah, and I better not get sassy with my boss, because if I'm laid off, then I'm in big trouble. And so this does color people's perception. It's a tragedy. I mean, what happens if young people starting their careers enter into a weak labor market and have a hard time finding a job? How long does it take them to recover from that bad start? And the basic answer is forever. If the labor market is poor when you're starting out, you are put permanently down. You never get as far up the ladder as you would have otherwise. And so this is a big deal.
I think this actually is what we're seeing in Britain. Have been seeing. We have had a really rather weak labour market in exactly this sense, even compared to our European peers. I'm not talking about America since the pandemic. And I think it's become a very deep source of anxiety for young people, percolates through to their parents because they're concerned about them too. And I think it's a big source of worry. So I think it's considerably worse than in the US from what little I know. So in this area. So I recognize this concern. But so what's causing it? It would suggest that the employers are being very cautious. They don't want to hire because they don't know what's going to happen next. But it also would suggest that basically underlying demand is quite weak. And that seems to sort of justify the Fed to cut rates. And some people on the Fed are saying they should. At the same time, well, inflation is pretty damn sticky. So how do you read that? If you were sitting on the Fed board, what do you think they should be doing?
Glad I'm not sitting on the Fed board. And,
I agree.
I actually do know people who are and are, they go around muttering dual mandate, because it's really hard because of the employment.
I know quite a few too, and I think it's a very tough job at the moment.
And by the way, the thing, if it's weak demand, you would expect more layoffs. It might be weak demand, but it might be also just this freezing effect of uncertainty. And possibly AI. There's at least some straws in the wind that suggest that early business applications of AI are reducing hiring, or particularly of college graduates, or simply that companies are kind of waiting for AI, that if you're Amazon, you're planning to replace a lot of your workers with robots a year or two down the pike, you might not want to hire a lot of people now. So it's a little bit of a mystery. I've never seen anything like it. We normally have a pretty one-to-one relationship between the unemployment rate and hiring rates. And this situation of not especially high unemployment, but very weak hiring is really quite novel.
That could be, of course, as you say, the uncertainty. That could be tariff generated or tariff policy generated. And is the sticky inflation, despite what seems not a very strong economy, also related to that?
No, I mean, my guess, if anything, the inflation, maybe, actually, you could say that the tariff uncertainty has slowed the pass-through of tariffs into consumer prices. Raising prices does piss off your customers, to use the technical term. And if you think the tariffs might go away, I mean, if you think that sometime in the next few weeks, the Supreme Court might rule that all those tariffs that are making your products expensive may disappear in a puff of smoke, then you may choose to eat the tariffs until that's resolved. As I said, you're thinking about being a Federal Open Market Committee, and you say, so what is happening to the economy? And the answer is, God knows. It's, how do you make an interest rate call in that situation?
So let's look at the other area of really big uncertainty. You just mentioned AI's impact on the jobs market. I suppose that would suggest that productivity is improving. It might be, if that's, they're doing more with fewer workers. That might suggest inflation could fall, should be falling. Separate the two effects of the AI. Just say a little bit more about where you are now. We discussed it in the previous series on this issue of, is there going to be Jobageddon, as it were, as a result of AI? Are we going to suddenly start seeing really dramatic effects on the employment of relatively educated young workers, which I've always thought would be a nightmare politically for all our societies? If you can't give these people good prospects, well, these are the people who start revolutions. They did that, young unemployed people who've got educated degrees and so forth. That's how all the 1848 revolution started. So this is a big deal politically. Is this what we might be seeing?
It's possible. I mean, so far, again, it's all pretty modest as far as we can tell. It is so difficult to interpret the various studies. Most businesses report that they have not actually succeeded in making productive use of AI, but some have, and then there's some, it's all over the place. And there's also this weird thing, which is that a number of businesses are telling their employees, you must use AI, and when they can't actually figure out what good it does them. So we're in this kind of liminal space where it's all potential and hype, and maybe, I mean, what it can do is, it used to be that there were lots of things that were simple, common sense things that we just couldn't do, like recognize the same object seen from different angles. And all of a sudden, all of that is a solved problem. Translation by computer was a joke, and all of a sudden it becomes actually pretty damn good. So there's no question this is a powerful, productive technology, but we don't know yet. And then, of course, I guess there's the sort of short-run macroeconomic impact, which is that this is driving a lot of business investment and is driving the stock market. And quite possible, as was the case in the late 90s, that you have a genuine, productive, important technology, and everybody who invests heavily in it loses their shirt.
Yeah, let's come to that, because that's the other aspect of it. So there are two aspects of this. One, the stock market is incredibly buoyant because of this, or has been. And maybe it's filtering over into some other speculative bubbles. I think you just wrote about Bitcoin. That may also be related to the deregulation going on, the encouragement of cryptocurrencies more broadly. I mean, that may be really separate from AI, but it's noticeable. So there must be a wealth effect. I mean, at least among relatively well-off people, because the stocks have gone through, of these major companies, gone through the moon. And second, associated with that, there's a huge investment boom, which this is funding. The stock market must be funding to some degree. Now, if it turns out that the investment doesn't really get a decent return, which is perfectly plausible given that we don't see business models, and the stock, then two things will happen. The stock prices will fall and the investment will fall, decline, weaken dramatically, and they will have all this stuff which have been built, data centers and so forth, but it really will be very low return, though perhaps quite useful in some way. But this is bad for the future of the economy. And the administration with the budget and so forth has sort of shot the macroeconomic bolts, except for the monetary policy ones. And then there is a concern out there that actually they're beginning to borrow more. It's not all funded out of profits. There are marginal companies borrowing a lot. There is a lot going on in private credit, which we don't really understand. And there are financial risks. So what's the downside here? How bad could it get? I don't have any real reading on this, but there are these negative stories you can tell about where we are.
Yeah, a lot of talk about the circular financing of the AI related companies are all kind of taking in each other's washing, making the bottom lines look sort of artificially good.
Well, they are a circularity.
They are borrowing. A year ago, you could say, well, this AI boom is being financed out of retained earnings. And so, Meta may lose a lot of money, but who cares? But now there's a lot of borrowing, and markets are taking note. Oracle, credit default swaps feel young again. It's like we're going back to 2008. But the credit default swaps on Oracle have just blown out, suggesting that people do think there's a significant risk that one of the big players here might end up defaulting on some of the debt it's taken on. Financial stability is always, it's a game of whack-a-mole. You're always trying to knock down financial risks, and you're often at risk of fighting the last war. So we dealt with a lot of the old shadow banking stuff, but now we have private credit that creates a whole new set of risks that are at some level, at a metaphysical level, similar to the old shadow banking stuff. I don't think we're at the edge of another financial crisis, but then, to be honest, I didn't think that in 2007 either.
Well, I didn't then, but I was more worried than I am now, because I tend to think this is narrower. And I think it's not related to housing, which is a classic asset class to create problems. We saw that all over Europe. And the big companies involved in this are in cash flow and profit terms basically about as solid as a company can possibly be. So they're obviously marginal players, but Microsoft, Google, Meta, these are pretty solid companies. So if you succeed in getting a colossal financial crisis out of this, I think that would be quite a major achievement.
A financial crisis is not high on my list of things to worry about. But then again, our track record, the IMF once did a systematic study of how successful are economists at predicting recessions. And the answer is a 0 success rate. So,
well, that is what does worry me is that when this happens, it could well be under another Fed chair, and that might not be a very sensible person. And I think on the whole, Jay's been a pretty sensible person. And by and large, actually, over the last 20, 25, 30 years, you've had pretty sensible Fed chairs. And that might not be true a year from now. And that could make a big difference. The Fed chair really matters if there's problems.
Yeah, without getting into the individuals, but there are a group of people on the short list range from somewhat weak to absolutely horrifying. Now, what saving grace to some extent is that the Fed chair is not a chief executive who can just make the decisions. It's monetary policy. It's a committee, and the committee seems likely to remain sensible at least for a couple of years. So you're saying that these investments will leave us with useful stuff. That's one of the things that's unclear. When the 90s investments, you ended up with a lot of fiber optic cable in the ground that didn't get used right away, but was eventually useful. But the data centers probably depreciate quite fast. And so in some ways, this is more like the companies that got over their skids on shale, which turned out that shale wells depreciate much faster than conventional oil and gas wells. And so we might have a bubble, a big waste of resources that is really lost. We may be just burning up real resources on stuff that won't get used, especially if they're kind of taking the wrong approach. One of the things that we're worrying about now is that the Chinese have been focusing on smaller models that are less comprehensive, that apparently can achieve about 90% of the effectiveness of the big models at far lower cost. Aside from the inherent questions about AI, there's also the question is, are we doing AI wrong?
That is, I think, a really interesting possibility, and that would certainly justify a pretty big collapse in stock prices and investment. I've just been to China, and they certainly do feel that they've got a more sensible approach. And when you look at the amounts being spent on these data centers and the dubious benefits in terms of improvements at the margin, yeah, you can ask that question. The Chinese have to do more with less, and often in history, that's turned out to be a pretty good approach, hasn't it? Let's put this all together. People aren't very happy about the economy. You've still got the Epstein files. There certainly seem to be an amazingly hot topic. Trump's approval is remarkably low. So coming back to where we started, could we begin to feel that not only we passed peak Trump, but that we should really begin to feel that the American system will be able to get through this? And I'm not sure, but what might be the case, it seems to me, that in order to maintain power, obviously they will be terrified of losing power, they're going to have to do some really egregious things, like putting the army or National Guard or both into places when important votes happen, like the midterms, in order to discourage people from voting. It would be so obvious that this is a coup attempt, and they might not get away with it. So I'm beginning to feel maybe this will work out. How optimistic are you of that? I mean, I thought of it was 2-1 on at this stage about 8 months ago, that Trump would get away with it and he would create a dictatorship. But now I'm beginning to think it's less than evens.
My view is that it's more likely than not that the autogolp, the self-coup will fail, that Trump and company will not succeed in installing permanent autocratic rule in America. It tells you something about where we are, that believing that they probably won't do that makes me optimistic. No, it's still very scary, but it's really looking like they may not be able to pull this off. Now, that doesn't mean that we've gotten through it safely, even if we have, even if that's how it works out. For one thing, an enormous amount of damage has been done.
Of course, to America and to the world.
To us, to the world. I mean, the United States was the essential country, and we are now completely unreliable. Nobody will trust America for decades, even if it ends. And then there's this longer term question, even if we get through and we end up with a Democratic Congress next year, and then we end up with a Democratic president in 2028, winning every election is not a reliable strategy for safeguarding democracy. So, the fact that just on the political side, if we don't end up not just holding back this bums rush from MAGA, but if we don't end up having a Truth and Reconciliation Commission of some kind, some accountability for all of this, then we're still in very, very bad shape.
The thing that particularly worries me, and I follow this very closely, and perhaps it's partly because of my family background, but my history of my family is refugees from Hitler. There seems a remarkable amount, astounding amount of genuine, clear fascism, even Nazism, circulating around on the extreme right. And even 3 or 4 years ago, I wasn't aware of that. And it's possible if the Republicans are in opposition, that's where they're going to go. These people only have to win once, and you really have a problem. It remains very, very scary, I think. But I certainly will feel better if it looks as though they haven't pulled this one off.
Yeah, put one foot in front of the other. Is that, all of the people, politically involved people, I'm saying is, if we ask, what can we do to guarantee the survival of American democracy? The answer is no guarantees.
I'm writing a piece on that as a new chapter for my book, and it's a very, very good question. So in next week's episode, we're going to talk about the economics of MAGA man. And it is MAGA man to a significant extent, isn't it? And more generally, the sort of the manosphere, or whatever you call it. On the other hand, well, what does the newly elected New York Mayor Zoran Mamdani tell us? What does that mean about the future of the Democrats? And look at it from the economic point of view. And meanwhile, I think it's your turn to tell us about your cultural coda.
Actually, the one that captured my mood most correctly is some old Pink Floyd, The Great Gig in the Sky, where the lyrics consist of nothing but an extended wordless scream. That's kind of where I am in my view of the world right now.
So when I was asked to do this, I found it, I think, much more difficult than you do. But as I said before, I'm a sort of opera person. And I was thinking about the best things about tyranny, which has, after all, been the theme. Last time, I think I had Fidelio from Beethoven. This one is even more direct. It's from Puccini's Tosca, which is about the evil ways of an Italian police boss who's really a gangster called Scarpia. And the song is by Tosca, who's the heroine, whose lover has been tortured, and she sings this absolutely magnificent song, Vici d'arte. I lived for art. I was a peaceful, loving, decent and honorable human being. Why, God, have you inflicted this upon me?
Well, all I can say is our cultural references are not very much like what you expect from a couple of economists, but here we go.
Well, yeah, you have to remember, even economists are human beings sometimes.
Some of us.
And that's it for the Wolf-Krugman Exchange on the Economic Show for this week. And we'll be back here at the same time next week.